Suffering, Luxuries, and Charity. This week and with this video, we will consider some argumentation presented by a guy. His name is Peter Singer. He's a professional ethicist, a philosophy person. He's worked in ethics and in philosophical argumentation for 30 years, 25, 30 years at least. And he is extremely impressive in the way he can craft arguments. The way his mind works tends to be just a little different than a lot of other ethicists and philosophy people. And he has a unique approach to these three notions: the notion of suffering, luxuries, and the idea of charity, or the practice of charity. Singer, in terms of his values, like his core values, as far as the articles and argumentation we'll encounter this week, as far as what we're encountering goes, his core value is that he values saving the lives of starving, suffering children. Like, just think of children that do not have enough to eat, and so they end up starving, or they don't have enough clean drinkable water, so they end up dying from dehydration, or they capture an illness based on various parasites being in the water, or they lack proper medical care. That is the idea of this suffering that he has in mind, like dying due to dehydration or starvation or some preventable medical ailment that interventions do exist that could prevent it, but for whatever reason the child doesn't receive them, and so they suffer. They endure many days to many years in sort of painful existence. That's what Singer has in mind by the notion of suffering. And so he values the activities or practices of trying to alleviate that suffering in the children, or saving their lives in the process. And that's the core focus. That's his core value, is save those lives, alleviate that suffering. But he also, and he disvalues, the opposite side of the coin is that Singer disvalues allowing kids to suffer or to die when that could have been prevented. Now, it's not that there were not resources to prevent it, it's just that they were not allocated or applied to that domain, that the resources were spent on other things. For example, things like luxuries. And we'll get into in this video what Singer actually means by like basic needs versus luxuries, and how his articles and argumentation are essentially a reinterpretation or a reconceptualization of what charity actually means as far as morality goes. Like, for Singer, it's a case of charities should not really be all that charitable as we think about it. It's more of an obligation, something that morality kind of demands upon us, or it's a bill we all should be paying, but many of us are not. Things like that, and we'll get into it. But it is an extremely interesting way of thinking that Singer will present us with. First, the problem, just using this sort of philosophical pattern of inquiry that we're all becoming familiar with. And we won't go through the entire pattern in this video. We'll just use the pieces of it that kind of help us that help take us as quickly as possible into what Singer's saying. Because much of what's really interesting about Singer isn't so much what he says on the face of his articles, it's how he replies to the objections against his argumentation. That's where we want to reach in this video and walk through a significant portion of the way he thinks. In order to, I think that's one of the most valuable aspects about Peter Singer, is being able to put ourselves in his mind and see the world the way he sees it, at least momentarily. None of this is to say that Singer is right about everything. Remember, all we're doing at this point is we're entertaining, not necessarily endorsing, we're entertaining what Singer has to say and thinking about it. And so much of this entire outline is presented in terms of like how Singer would think, what he would say if asked certain questions, or in the process of explaining how he sees the world. So we get a window into his mind as far as the material for this week goes. And I think that's extremely helpful for people to see. Anytime you walk into a disagreement or a debate, especially when there's like core values and those are in conflict with other people, being able, if at all possible, to see the world the way they do, even temporarily, will often prevent tremendous misunderstanding, and it allows where the possibility of progress is still real. Like, even though we may disagree fundamentally about certain things, there may be some agreement, some compromises that could be reached. But if we are never able to see the world exactly like someone else sees it, which we could never do that perfectly, but if we can't even get close, it's extremely difficult to make any progress. So what we'll be doing in this video is trying to put on our Singer, goggles or glasses so we can see things the way he does. And then during this week's discussion, we'll have an ability to decide, do we buy into what he's saying, or is he successful in turning aside all these sorts of objections that have been launched against his reasoning? That being said, what is the main problem? Like, what does Singer, what is the problem that he's trying to combat, trying to turn aside? Well, interestingly enough, most everybody buys into the notion that little kids suffering and dying needlessly is a pretty bad idea. That's not the ideal way of the world. So Singer, that's not really his problem. Most people would buy that. What his problem is that many people tend to have a sort of negative knee-jerk reaction to his reasoning, the way he's trying to express these ideas. And the knee-jerk reaction is to the idea that morality, like what makes things right or wrong, good or bad, as we've talked about in previous weeks, especially during our discussion of objectivism and relativism and all that the idea that morality might sometimes require people to forego and or sacrifice various luxuries that they've become accustomed to in order to be moral. It's an interesting phenomenon where many times most people will say, yeah, I want to do the right thing. Yeah, this will be a good thing to do. But as soon as it comes time to say, oh, yeah, well, in order to do the right thing, you may have to sacrifice going on this vacation. You may never get to go on that vacation because in order to do the right thing, you won't have the resources left over to go on that vacation. Or a person, it may be that someone wants to do the right thing, the morally good thing, but then they find out, oh, in order to do that, I have to give up my free time, from work, or some of my money, or I may not be able to buy all the same luxurious things that I've always been able to buy in the past. Those kind of things, people tend not to. We'll see as we go through this video that sort of negative knee-jerk reaction is like, whoa, I'm cool with being moral as long as I never have to give up anything that I enjoy. That sort of mentality is extremely common, and that's the problem Singer is trying to overcome, is how to provide people with reasoning to sacrifice even when they don't want to. Like, how do you try to convince someone that, yeah, even though you may not want to sacrifice in order to do the right thing, you should still be willing to sacrifice in order to do the right thing? That's a challenge. That's the big problem, that Singer has to be really crafty and clever in the way he presents his reasons and his responses to objections in order to try to combat many people's knee-jerk reaction to like, oh yeah, I'm not willing to sacrifice nearly as much as singers saying I might need to in order to do the right thing. And then, and what's bad is it's not necessarily bad, but it's just it's a thing that this sort of mentality chains up pretty quickly with other things like singers implying that I have to sacrifice a lot of stuff to do the right thing. Well, I don't want to be immoral, but I also don't want to give up my stuff. Therefore, singers reasoning there must be something wrong with it. Does everybody see that? Just think about that, how that's so human, and that's the sort of problem that Singer has to deal with, is this human tendency to say, I want to be good, but I also don't want to have to sacrifice a whole lot to be good. And Singer's saying that I have to do both. I have to sacrifice a whole lot in order to actually be good. So Singer just can't be right, can he? That's what Singer's trying to combat in this article. So the question is, might we be morally obligated to give far more than we often do? And see, that question captures what I've been talking about. That Singer's going to answer that question with a resounding yes. Being moral sometimes requires that we give up far more of our time, money, skills, our abilities, etc., than we often do or ever would often want to do. That's Singer's big, bold claim, is that yes, sometimes being moral, doing the right thing, requires tremendous sacrifice. And while many people may buy into that, they may not be willing to buy into how much sacrifice Singer thinks it sometimes takes. But we'll see. Singer's argument. This argument shows up in everything we read, watch this week, and I've just kind of restated it in a way that seems to me to focus on what he's actually saying, what's really at stake. Singer has a whole lot of words, but this argument is just at the core of everything he says. And so it's known to be one of the simplest little arguments. It's extremely straightforward to say it, but it is very difficult, or it tends to be, to refute it. And we'll see why as we go along. Singer's argument, we will read this. Suffering and death from lack of food, drinkable water, shelter, and proper medical care, especially when the victims of such are children, is terrible. That's premise one. Essentially, suffering and death of children due to a lack of food, drinkable water, shelter, proper medical care, that's a terrible thing. That's just a bad situation. That's all that first premise is saying. The second premise or reason, whatever way you want to refer to this, the second reason or premise is, if one is able to prevent terrible things from happening, like children dying or suffering due to a lack of food, drinkable water, etc., if a person is able to prevent such terrible things like this without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral worth or importance, then one is morally obligated to do so. Third, most of the citizens of affluent and wealthy countries, for example, the U.S., us, you could also throw in other countries like England, Australia, many European countries, there's many affluent countries, South American, all over the world. But for our purposes, let's just think of the U.S., where we are. So most of the citizens of, say, the U.S. are able to prevent the suffering and death from lack of food, etc., of children in other countries, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral worth or importance. But they don't do so. Thus, or therefore, the conclusion, most of the citizens in affluent countries, that is, that's you, that's me, that's most all other U.S. citizens, many European citizens, etc., are terribly immoral. Notice where we end up. This is a claim to the effect that you, me, all the rest of us affluent nations are terribly immoral, meaning we're bad. Whether we want to believe it or not, we supposedly are. That's a big claim. That's one of those big, bold claims that sometimes the ethicists make that very few people want to be thought of as immoral. So anytime an argument ends with this sort of notion, and this is a big sweeping claim, that people of the affluent nations are immoral. Many of them, maybe not all, but many. So, how do we get here? How do we get to this claim? Well, the way the reasoning works is that the sort of idea is children that die due to these things. They don't have enough food, enough water, things like that, medical care. That is terrible. And then the idea is, well, if such could be prevented without having to sacrifice anything of comparable moral worth, then that's what people ought to do. Well, the people in this country and other countries, affluent nations, they don't do that. They don't make these sacrifices. Therefore, they're moral. That's all there is to his argument. It's a matter of, if you want to be moral, then you need to be doing a certain thing. Well, we don't do that certain thing, therefore we're immoral. That's the structure of this argumentation. One way to summarize it, to get to sort of the heart, the thrust of what Singer is saying, is that each and every day we could, like all of us and many citizens, maybe not all, but many citizens in this country, could prevent the suffering and deaths of children caused by these various lacks by giving much of our time, effort, or money to various reputable charitable organizations. We're absolutely morally obligated to prevent such terrible things from happening, and he gives us a defense of that. But instead, we choose to spend our days frittering away our time and money on totally frivolous things, like watching television and movies, like paying for Netflix or Hulu or Amazon Prime, playing on Facebook or with video games, buying iPads, iPods, iPhones, $1,000 to $1,500 phones, fancy food, fancy water, like Uber, say whatever. Think of your fanciest bottled water. Fancy clothes, cars, trucks, houses, buying name brand rather than store brand products. That's frivolous. Having professionals cut our hair rather than doing it ourselves, etc. Basically, this is according to Singer, we choose personal entertainment, luxury, and maintaining our vanity over fulfilling our moral obligation to save these suffering kids, to prevent this terrible thing from happening that we could prevent if we were to just give up some of our luxuries. Thus, each and every day, we're terribly immoral. That's the gist of Singer's argumentation. That's how it comes into our houses and directly applies to us. In many cases in ethical argumentation, we can opt out. We can say, oh, well, this is talking about abortion. Well, that doesn't really apply to me. Or, oh, this is talking about parents dealing with this situation of a child with various mental impairments and the actions they took. We can be like, yeah, that's at a distance from me. Maybe that doesn't directly apply to me. The interesting part about Singer's argumentation is it enters our homes and our daily lives. That's exactly what this part C does. Is it's taking inventory of all these things that we spend our money, our time, our skills, our resources in an effort to acquire and do. Like, we watch TV, we do play on the internet, which has to be paid for. We may play video games, or we may buy fancy cell phones. We may buy fancy cars. We may buy fancy tires and wheels for our cars. We may buy a whole set of spoons when, given the size of our family, 3 spoons would do. Or we may see, oh, here's a sale, I'll get these 10 towels. I don't know how I'll ever use 10 towels, but I'll get them anyway. That's all examples of what Singer would consider to be luxury items. Those are things that we don't have to have in order to meet our basic needs. Our basic needs on Singer's account are things like food, not necessarily name brand food, but we have to have some form of food. We have to have drinkable water. We have to have some minimal level of medical care. If we are sick, we need to be able to go see about, going to a doctor or whatever. Even if it's a home remedy, we still need to be able to buy the home remedy stuff. We need to have clothing so that we don't freeze in the winter or burn up in the summertime. And we need to have some form of shelter so when it rains, we're not standing in the rain because of various reasons. We could get sick, on and on and on. So those are basic needs like food, shelter, drinkable water, clothing, basic medical care. Those are basic needs on Singer's account. He's not begrudging anybody having those. Where it begins to become a morally problematic situation, though, is when all the other sort of things are added on top of those basic needs. For example, does anyone in order to live have to have $1,000 cell phone? Does anybody in order to live have to have extra spoons lying around? Does anybody that in order to live, do they have to have tons of fancy socks lying around? In order to live, does anybody have to have a more expensive car, or would a more moderately priced one do? In order to live, that's the thing. In order to live, to continue. A way sometimes to think about it is if we were to move back, say 300 years back in human existence and civilization, what of our current technologies and items wouldn't exist? And then the idea is to say, humans continued up until this part, and they didn't necessarily have to have all of these things we have today, so those things are luxurious. They're add-ons to our existence rather than necessities. And so what Singer's pushing here is the idea that those things, all of these sort of frivolous, luxurious things, are not basic necessities. Therefore, they will never have the degree of moral importance or worth as like someone's life, especially the life of a child. So that's what we're comparing when he's talking about comparable moral worth. We're comparing buying Netflix every month and the money that's spent on that and the enjoyment that's received from that to the life of a child, or the suffering or the well-being of a child. And the idea is, are those two things morally comparable? Like, is the life and well-being of a child more morally important than my $1,000 cell phone? Now, I don't have a $1,000 cell phone, by the way, but, that would be an example. Or, all kinds of things. Like buying the National Enquirer at the grocery store aisle. Does anybody actually need to buy the National Enquirer or the Globe or whatever in order to continue to live? Well, if the answer is no to that, then Singer's going to say, well, compare the purchase of that National Enquirer or Globe magazine. Compare the worth, the value that which your enjoyment in it's tied up in that calculation against the worth and the value of a child's life. And then he's going to say, well, the child's life's going to win out in terms of more valuable. And so the reality is a person could have not bought that Enquirer, not bought the Globe magazine, not bought that fancy cell phone, and those resources, that money, the time, everything that went into acquiring that resource could have been directed over there towards saving the lives of dying, suffering children. And the way this sort of second premise works is if one could save lives or prevent suffering by sacrificing something that's not of the same moral worth as what's being saved, namely the child's life, then one's morally obligated to do that. And if they don't do that, then they're immoral. That's how he gets to these conclusions that, most of us in affluent nations are terribly immoral. Why? Because we have this sort of conditional statement that if we could save lives by giving up some luxuries, then we ought to do it. Well, we don't give up those luxuries and end up don't saving those lives. Instead, we buy the luxuries. And by doing that, kids die. And well, Singer's like, well, it's terribly immoral for these kids to die. Even more so if we could do something about it and yet choose not to, especially if what we're choosing to do instead is indulge in luxuries. That seems really kind of bad. That's what Singer would like for us to think, at least. This is the way he sees the world, and as I said, that's the purpose, is we kind of want to be able to see the world like Singer does. Singer doesn't see extra towels in our bathroom closet as innocent things. He sees every one of those extra towels or extra spoons, that's dead children. So think about that sort of extreme way of seeing the world. And it's not extreme to say Singer's an extremist. No, it's just an extreme sort of contrast to the way many of us would think about it. So it's kind of like, we'll just pick on, whatever. Some companies say that you see an iPhone commercial or an advertisement or a promotion, and it's like, oh, look at all this latest and greatest thing that this piece of technology can do. You can talk to people with social networking. You can, play on the internet. You can do all these things. Oh, yeah, and you can make a call too. But that's, whatever. We got all this other stuff, They rarely sell a new cell phone based off of the basic function. Yeah, it makes calls. That's not what's promoted. It's all of this add-on stuff that is promoted, or how awesome it feels. Look how it looks. This aesthetic value. And the thing is Singer doesn't see anything beautiful there. He doesn't see that iPhone and all these new apps and all the stuff one could do with it. What he sees is a bunch of children that died and suffered and are continuing to die and suffer because people are spending money on that phone rather than spending it in the direction of those children. That for Singer, that new phone is a child's life that was traded for it. Just keep that in mind. And that is a severe contrast. Like, looking into our cabinets and seeing that we have, like some name brand Fruit Loops or something, cereal, rather than just, like Fruit Circles or something that, you could buy at some other grocery store that are much, much cheaper. Singer's going to see the choice to go with the name brand, the Kellogg's brand, versus just, the off brand, as a conscious choice to pick luxury over the lives and well-being of children. So that name brand box of whatever, a name brand jar of mayonnaise, that's all those pennies and dimes and nickels and dollars that could have been funneled over to make the life of a child better, and yet it wasn't. So for Singer, that's a bad trade. That's an immoral trade to make. But we'll see. We haven't gotten into how he defends any of this. We're just trying to understand the way he sees our stuff. That's what it comes down to. But it's not just our stuff. It's all the labor, how long we work at our jobs and spend in our lives in the accumulation of these things. It's like all that effort, all that time. Like, think about how much time an average person spends, say, watching TV. Even if it's just internet-based TV or it's on an actual television, it doesn't matter. But the hours one spends in, say, this country, engaged in what might be referred to as personal entertainment. Just getting lost in shows or YouTube channels or, the latest drama on a social networking site. And think about all that time that's devoted. I mean, almost routinely devoted day after day. And all of that time and that effort, it's not just money, it's time too and effort. That all of that is directed toward entertainment, which entertainment is often, thought of as more luxurious. You're entertained when you're not, we are entertained when we're not working to survive. If we're just working to survive, we don't have time for entertainment normally. So entertainment immediately implies free time, luxury time. And Singer's like, well, all of that stuff could have been traded and there'd be more kids that didn't suffer and die in these horrible fashions. And yet, people in more affluent nations tend to just continue with their entertainment while kids across the land suffer and die. And to Singer, that's a bad moral trade. So you see, those hours spent watching that latest television show, those are hours where children are dying. Those are hours where kids are dying because someone's choosing to be entertained rather than use that time and resources to save those kids' lives. Just think about that. I'm not saying this is a pleasant picture by any means, but it is the way he's seeing this stuff. And so Singer's aware that many people, they may initially find this sort of way of arguing and his actual argument with reasons deeply disturbing and perhaps utterly offensive. He's perfectly aware of this. Remember, that's his big problem, is how to overcome this knee-jerk reaction where people are like, well, Singer, this is not nice at all. Get out of my house and looking at my stuff. It's like, just be human about it, where it's like he's tromping in deep into our lives with these reasons and this sort of argumentation. And people tend to not like that and be offended. Well, Singer knows that. That's the big problem he has to try to overcome. And he says, okay, his overall response, though, to people who have this offense or, concern or distaste for what Singer's argumentation, his reasons are implying about them, namely they're terribly immoral because they're spending hours watching, a movie on TV rather than saving kids, that his response to people who say, some people would be like, how dare you, Singer? How dare you come into my life and try to tell me I'm doing something wrong when I'm just taking time for myself, me? Singer's going to say, I can understand that you may not like my argumentation or the conclusion. I can even understand that it may disturb you. But just because you don't like it doesn't make it any less true. And just because you don't like it or perhaps don't want to do what it suggests, it doesn't thereby follow that you're any less morally obligated to do it. If you disagree with my argument, then show me where it went wrong. Which of my premises and reasons is false? And that gets to the heart of the only successful way to refute Singer is to find a problem in 1 through 3. That one of these sentences, in order for his conclusion not to follow and not to be true, is there has to be a problem in 1 through 3. A person has to demonstrate, this is the only way you would ever convince Singer to back off, at least, is that, or to ever escape this conclusion that you may in fact be morally terrible for buying the new phone. The only way we can successfully defeat someone like Singer is to find a flaw in his reasons. So let's think about that. We'll go through each of his reasons, make sure we understand them and what he means by them, and then we can maybe think about, is there a flaw to be found? So we need to understand his defense of each of them. So premise 1, suffering and death from lack of food, drinkable water, shelter, and proper medical care is terrible, especially if it's children that are undergoing this. Singer's defense of this premise. This is a quote from Famine, Affluence, and Morality. That's where this comes from. Singer says, I think that most people will agree with, well, premise one, although one may reach the same view by different routes. I shall not argue for this view. People can hold all sorts of eccentric positions, and perhaps for some of them it would not follow that death by starvation or the lack of medical care, etc., is in itself bad. It is difficult, perhaps impossible, to refute such positions, and so for brevity I will henceforth take this assumption, premise one, as accepted. Those who disagree need read no further. Okay, so what is his defense? Essentially, the only person his argument can apply to is someone who's at least willing to give him premise one. To say that, in fact, suffering and death from a lack of food, drinkable water, shelter, and proper medical care, that is a terrible thing. Singer cannot talk to anyone who doesn't buy into that. That if someone thinks that starving to death or freezing to death and all the days leading up to that, if someone happens to think, well, that might be a good thing, then Singer cannot talk to that person. He's not even going to try. Like, it's just a matter of if someone he says you either have to accept premise one, and if you don't, I can't have anything to say to you. Because to him, it's impossible to conceptualize suffering and death like this. We're talking about starvation, dehydration, death and suffering due to starvation, dehydration, dying of exposure. We don't have anywhere to sleep that's covered up, so we freeze to death in the night. Or we die due to, say, we get a cold and then we don't have any resources to be able to see about that cold. And we don't get over it in 7 to 10 days. And then we die from it, like we cough ourselves to death. Just think about how horrible that is. And Singer's going to say, yeah, if you don't think going out that way is bad, I can't talk to you. That's his defense of premise one. Now, is that the best defense? Do we buy it? Or, well, either way, in order to continue with Singer, we just have to give it to him that dying and suffering in these ways is a bad thing for whoever experiences it. It's not a great way to go on the best of days. That, we could die in our sleep or we could starve to death. If we had to pick, what would you choose? And if you choose dying peacefully in your sleep over starvation, then Singer's going to say, yeah, I think you'll give me premise one. This is just Singer. This isn't me, Stephen. This is just Singer. And so I put a lot more words in here just to keep explaining what he said here. But the general idea is Singer's defense of premise one is just to say, either you give me this sentence that it is true, suffering and dying due to these sort of preventable causes is bad. If you give me that, great. We'll go on to premise two. If you don't give me that, well, then my argument has nothing to say to you at all. And for our purposes in this class, I think it's best we just give him premise one and say, yep, those kind of ways of dying and suffering are pretty bad. I think that's best for us just to do it. But now, individually, if you don't buy that, that's fine too. But Singer has nothing to say to you if you don't. Premise two. So let's go to it. Maybe we have more room to maneuver with premise two. So this is a conditional statement. It says, if one is able to prevent something terrible from happening, like if one's able to prevent little kids starving to death or dying due to exposure, freezing to death outside in the night. If one were able to stop that from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral worth or importance, then one's morally obligated to do so. Hopefully that now all these words that I've said have kind of made clear what that premise is saying. And this premise too, this is the sort of heart and soul of Singer's whole argument. This is the premise that it has to work for Singer to get to his conclusion. And so what does it mean? Well, it's conditional. It's a conditional statement. It's a if X, then Y structure. This structure means that this premise, first of all, it only applies to a certain portion of our population. As I alluded to, it doesn't matter if you live in an affluent nation like, say, the U.S. And affluent just means there's wealth around. Enough money and resources and time is available for people to have luxurious stuff. They're not just fighting tooth and nail every day, all day just to survive. The majority of people in a nation are not having to do that. The majority has time for luxurious things. You know, they still have time to go shopping for extra towels that, according to Singer, they don't need. Or they have time to sit down at night and watch television. They're not out there so exhausted from just being hammered all day, just trying to get enough resources to eat tomorrow, that they have time to, engage in television or playing on the internet or whatever. That's what it means to be affluent. It doesn't mean that one's rich. It doesn't mean that one's a billionaire. It doesn't mean that one makes much more than minimum wage a year. The reality is a lot of people that make a minimum wage in this kind of country and a lot of other countries, they still have time to watch TV at night. Well, if they do, then that's affluent on Singer's picture. So it's important to keep in mind where Singer's defining luxury and affluence. We're not talking about, as sometimes we hear, like that big rich 1% of a country. We're not talking about 1%. This is talking about all the way from the billionaires down to the minimum wage level. So think about how that's carving up society. That includes pretty much potentially 90 or more % of the U.S. population. Well, that's a majority, and that's affluence on Singer's picture. Have time to watch Netflix from time to time, or just look at whatever on the internet. But they're not like grinding away, working 20 hours a day just to have food for the next day. That 90%, not 1%, the 90% of the U.S. population, or European, or wherever, that population is affluent. On Singer's picture, that means it's an affluent nation. And the situation is that this premise, given that the if-then structure is there, is it only applies to the affluent. Anybody that's got time to watch TV for even an hour a night is affluent on this Singer picture. Even a few minutes, not even an hour. And anyone who has the extra resources and actually uses them to go buy, extra towels because they were on sale and they didn't necessarily need them at the time, that's affluent. Anybody who could afford to buy name brand rather than no brand or store brand, that's affluent. That, they have the resources, the access to do that. They're not really going to experience any decline at all in their overall resources if they choose to do that. Then essentially, who does this premise not apply to? It applies to the person who doesn't even have time hardly to put food in their mouth because they're doing everything they can just to get that food on a day-to-day basis. I mean, those who are utterly homeless. Those who are homeless, those who just don't have anything, really. And you don't necessarily have to be homeless. You could be where everything a person makes is completely and utterly consumed every month by the needs of oneself and one's family. Notice this premise allows room for a person to satisfy the basic needs for themselves and their families. He's not saying we have to sacrifice our own children's lives in order to save the lives of other kids we don't know. That's not what he's saying. He's saying anything over and above what it takes to secure the basic needs of ourselves and our children, that is excess. And it would probably, and I think that it's reasonable to say that many people in, say, the U.S. do have enough to go a little more than just the basic needs for themselves and their children, but some people don't. And that's reality, and in that case, Singer's argument doesn't apply to them. A person who, keep in mind, if one is not actually able to prevent the suffering and death without sacrificing something of comparable moral worth, namely their own health and well-being or the health and well-being of their children, if they could not donate $1 without their child being in as bad a shape as the child that might be saved by the dollar, then Singer's saying that person's not required to donate. But anybody who could donate that dollar and yet chooses not to, they swing into the gas station, to buy a Twinkie or something that they didn't have to have. They weren't going to starve without it. Or they go into the gas station and buy whatever when they're 5 minutes from their house and they have the same thing at their house, then it applies to all those people, which makes up a huge percentage of our population. I mean, the U.S. is a wealthier nation in this regard. I'm not have any judgment whatsoever about that. It's just observing the culture we live in. This is one of the things that seems to make a country like ours desirable to a lot of places, is that we do have excess. And so Singer's saying that those who don't have excess, that are just trying to live every day, well, this argument's not going to say anything about them. A person is not immoral for not saving kids when they can't do anything but barely save themselves. No, that person's not immoral for not saving starving children. But the person who is immoral, according to Singer's premise, this thing right here, is the person who could sacrifice that candy bar at the gas station that they didn't need, they just wanted, but yet they bought the candy bar anyway. The candy bar, the joy from the candy bar is not of the same comparable moral worth or importance, according to Singer, as the life of some child that's starving to death. That could have been prevented from starving to death if the resources used to obtain that candy bar had been reallocated toward the direction of that child. That's the way this works. So Singer's second premise, it is the core of his argumentation. He has to provide us with a defense of it, and he does. Here's how it works. How can we get our intuition to kind of understand what he's saying here? Well, he asks us to consider this infamous, and famous or infamous, depending on who you ask, example of a drowning baby. I know this may not be the happiest imagery, but anybody can imagine it. And I've given renditions, versions of it, a lot of examples. We're not going to go through all the versions of it. Everyone can read that on their own time this week. But the core example is all he really needs. He says, suppose that you're walking along the street or a road, doesn't matter, and you're on your way to, say, buy an ice cream cone. Or you're on your way from work. You've worked really hard and you're just on your way home. You just want to get home and watch Netflix or something. Or you're going to buy an ice cream cone, not because you're going to die if you don't have it, but just because. And you happen to have on, say, your fancy new shoes or new pants or whatever. Doesn't matter. And you happen to look over on the side of the road or the edge of the sidewalk, and you see a baby that's in a puddle. And it's not necessarily the deepest puddle, but it is deep enough that the child's drowning. They're flailing around. This little kid is in the process of drowning. They will die if somebody doesn't wade in this mud puddle. Assume it's a wide enough mud puddle. You'd have to wade into it to get to the child. That this child's drowning. And if no one does anything, this kid is certain to die. Singer's question is, would it be morally okay to say, you see this child drowning in this puddle, and you say, well, I got my good shoes on. Sorry, kid, there's nothing I can do for you. And you just walk on by. Or, well, it's kind of bad that you're drowning over there, kid, but, and think of a baby. I mean, we're talking about like 1 year old here. Cannot save themselves in any kind of way. And so, would it be morally okay for someone to simply walk by and say, I don't have time for that, I need my ice cream? Or, yeah, I'm wearing my good clothes today. Sorry, kid. You just got to deal with it on your own. And to allow that kid to die. Would it be morally okay for that person to do that? Singer's going to say that most people immediately recognize that it would be bad to do that. That of course we know that our shoes are dirtying up and ruining our brand new shoes is of nowhere near the same moral importance as that kid's life. Singer's going to say we intuitively know that we should save that child. That we're not having to sacrifice anything in the same value as that child's life that will be lost if we don't do it. Our shoes, our desire for that ice cream, our desire to just get home and sit down and watch TV, those desires, those things, they have nowhere near the value as that little kid's life that will be lost. Singer thinks that each of us can recognize that. And that anybody that at least accepted premise one, that starving, dying children, now it's a case of a drowning child, that's a bad way to go. That's suffering. And it's preventable. We could do something about it. In this case, all we got to do is wade in the bog and get the child out. We'd save the child's life. It's that simple. We just have to sacrifice our clothes, our ice cream, our relaxation time watching TV after work. We just have to sacrifice these little things, petty things, in order to save a kid's life. You see the very tone of my voice, like television show versus child's life. And that Singer would say that anybody who thinks that you absolutely, there's no thought that even needs to go into this. This drowning child, I can do something about it. Okay, I may have to get another pair of shoes, but so what? I saved the kid. If they think that that's the only moral recourse you have, if you think that, if you're like, I would have to save that child, it would be immoral for me to walk away and not save that child because I might not get my ice cream. If we think it's immoral to walk by for those frivolous things, then Singer says we have bought into premise 2. We have accepted that premise 2 is true. If one is able to prevent something terrible from happening, babies drowning in a puddle, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral worth, we'd only have to sacrifice our ice cream or our fancy shoes or television time versus a child's life. So ice cream and TV time is not of comparable moral worth or importance to the child's life, so we would not have to sacrifice anything of equal value. Then one's morally obligated to do so. If you say that, yes, by all means, we're morally obligated to save that child, if all I got to do is toss aside some luxury stuff, then you've bought into premise 2. You've accepted it as true. That's all it takes. In that drowning baby in that puddle, that example, most people that encounter Singer's argument. It's just a huge percentage. I don't know the exact numbers, but I do know that having presented this example to many, many, many people throughout many, many semesters, the consensus tends to be that many people will be like, yeah, of course you saved that kid. I'm not saying that, there may not be some that say, nah, it's okay, you can walk by. But typical human response, in my experience, tends to be, yes, of course you save the child and give up your ice cream to do it. That morality demands that minimally. That's just, whether it's subjective morality, relative morality, objectivist, or absolutist morality, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The whole spectrum of who do we answer to sort of positions we might take. A majority of people tend to say, yes, if I were to see this child drowning in a puddle and all I had to do was mess up my fancy new shoes, I would save that child. And I would feel like that was the right thing to do. And if you buy into that, then you bought into Singer's second premise. And remember, that's the premise that everything hangs on with this argument. And I've given many other examples of this. Like, for example, suppose that you were not physically able to jump off in the puddle and save the child, but there was somebody else standing by that they can't get in there either, but you have enough money for that person to run into the local store that's right across the street and buy, like, say, a big net to reach out there and scoop the child out. Say that both of you have allergies to the mud, or you have all these sort of things, but you do have the money either to buy an ice cream cone or to buy a net to save the child. Would it be the morally right thing to do to fork over the cash to buy that net to scoop that child up, or would it be perfectly morally okay to say, sorry kid, I've got to have my ice cream? I could help you, but my ice cream is worth more than your existence. That's another version of this thing. Another way to think about it is, say that you walk up to the puddle and you notice there's all these other people standing around the puddle. They're not doing anything. Every one of them is just standing there watching the child drown. And then you walk up and you would have to sacrifice your ice cream or your shoes or whatever. The only thing that's changed is that there's all these other people standing around doing nothing. Would your moral obligation to save that child diminish one iota? In the slightest. Wouldn't you still be just as morally obligated to sacrifice those shoes and go save that child? Or pay the money to get that net to go save that child? Even though there's all these other people standing around laughing, or just not paying attention. I mean, wouldn't we as individuals still be obligated to do something? The fact that all these other people are standing around doing nothing, that says nothing except, well, they're all doing the wrong thing. But that doesn't give us a pass on going and doing the right thing, does it? That's just a version of the drowning baby. Another thing is, suppose that the puddle wasn't right next to you. Suppose that you're walking down the sidewalk and here's someone and they have a computer open and it's showing you a child drowning in a puddle, and they say, yeah, all you got to do is, push this button and someone would run out and save the child. Or all you got to do is, hand over your ice cream and, or forgo your ice cream and give us the money from the ice cream and we'll pull that child out of the puddle. And you would be able to check up on all this. You'll see it real time that the kid gets pulled out of the puddle. You have the ability to access all the information. You know it's a legit offer. You know it's legit. Wouldn't you still be morally obligated to reach out virtually the hand to get that child out of the puddle? Singer would say yes, you would be. And then he does a version. of like this scenario in like a situation that comes up in one of the other articles this week is like Bob's Bugatti. Say that a guy has a Bugatti, which for those who don't know, a Bugatti is an extremely luxurious, expensive sports car. Like Bugatti Veyron was one of the super duper fanciest street race style cars that existed, for many, many years. May still be. But I mean, it was up there in the millions of dollars car. And the idea is Bob has a Bugatti, and there's a kid that's tripped and fallen and can't get off of a railroad track. Well, Bob has a new Bugatti car just come from the dealership, and this child, he looks out and sees this child on the railroad tracks. And Bob could stop the train. The train can't see the child, but the train would absolutely see Bob's Bugatti. But the train won't be able to stop in time. It's going to run into Bob's new car. It's not necessarily going to derail the train or hurt anybody in the train, but it will destroy the car in the process. So Bob's faced with a choice. He can park his multi-million-dollar fancy car that he just got on the tracks to stop the train, in the process sacrificing his big expensive car that he just got and wanted for years and years and worked to have. But in the process, he would save a kid's life. And Singer's like, all of us can understand that even if it's multi-millions of dollars worth of a car, that still does not morally outweigh the life of a child. That kid's life, that's all the years the child would continue to live. It's all the potential that child has. It's all that they could do in their life. That they have the potential to build Bob hundreds of Bugattis if they're allowed to grow up. And that's a good example of human potential and the value of human potential in comparison to just the value of a really fancy Bugatti car. The Bugatti car, we all know, can be replaced. Even if it may not be able to be replaced in Bob's lifetime by Bob, the car can be replaced. It can be repurchased, whereas the child's life cannot be. That's beyond our current technology. We can't go and just buy that same child's life at the store, one just like it. Because every human child's life is unique. It's distinctively unique. There's not a child factory that just stamps out the same kind of car, like the same kind of child, same personality, same mental abilities, as we can stamp out Bugatti Veyrons, even though they were handmade in many ways. But they were produced more than one, so you could get another one. And so the idea is, it's a one-off. Like, each child's life is unique. There's not another one like it. It's one of a kind. And isn't one of a kind human life priceless? Not millions of dollars value, hundreds of millions. We're talking about beyond the trillions of value. It can't ever be bought. It can only be had once. And the potential that comes along with it. And so that is the idea of even Bob's Bugatti. If you had to give up enormous amounts of money and luxury to save a drowning baby or a child on the railroad tracks, Singer thinks that our moral intuition should line up in the direction he's pointing and say, yeah, that kid's life, a child's life, and their well-being is always going to be worth morally more than pretty much any amount of money you can imagine. Any amount of money or luxury you can imagine. We're not talking about ice cream cones anymore. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars. That kid's life, that one little unique life and all the potential it contains is worth more morally. That's the idea anyway. So, if you think that you should donate or you should bend down to help that child, then you will have accepted Singer's second premise. You will have accepted that it's true. And remember, we had to grant him premise one. that it's terrible for kids to die in these horrible ways. And if we give him premise 2, well, then we just need to hop to premise 3. This is our last chance to hop off of Singer's argument. Premise 3,